Hi, everyone. I hope you're enjoying the conference so far. I am so excited to be a part of it and to listen to even more this afternoon. I have the distinct honor of getting to introduce Nancy Moorbacher, and she is an IBCLC FILCA that has helped nursing families since 1982 as a peer supporter. She became a board certified lactation consultant in 1991 and spent the next 10 years growing a large practice in the Chicago area, where she worked with one-on-one with families. With thousands of families, I should say. She has written 3 current books for nursing parents and 2 for lactation specialists, including her 2020 comprehensive evidence-based resource, Breastfeeding Answers, 2nd edition. Her breastfeeding solution app is used worldwide, and her YouTube channel has millions of views. She currently contracts with hospitals to improve their lactation practices. She created and presents a 95-hour training course in China to prepare aspiring lactation consultants for the IBLCE exam. She speaks at events around the world and was in the first group of 16 to be honored for their contributions to breastfeeding with designation FILCA, Fellow of International Lactation Consultant Association. Please make welcome Nancy Moorbacher.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. I guess I still am speaking at conferences around the world, only I'm doing it all from my home office, just like many of us these days. So our topic this afternoon is breast, bottle, and childhood obesity. And we're going to cover a number of different areas. First, we're going to talk about the problem, meaning, what is the issue with obesity these days? And then we're going to talk about the controversy over what the effect of infant feeding is on risk of obesity. And then we're going to talk about some of the differences in infant feeding biomechanics. So in other words, how bottle and breast are fundamentally different in terms of how babies feed, as well as in milk composition. And then I have a new section at the end where I'm going to talk about early rapid weight gain in breastfed babies. So that's going to be our topic for this afternoon. So the problem, well, when it comes to overweight and obesity, what we see, these are some of the statistics from the CDC, our US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and you can just see how the bars are going up over the years in terms of number of children who are suffering from overweight. So this is something that is not just in the United States. This is a statement from the World Health Organization in 2016 that overweight prevalence among children aged under 5 years has risen between 1990 and 2014 from 4.8 to 6.1, with numbers of affected children rising from 31 to 41 million during that time. So it's not just in the United States. This is really a phenomenon that we're seeing worldwide. So currently it's estimated that 1 in 3 children in the US is overweight or obese. And the problem with that is that obese children usually become obese adults. And in my first talk today, I talked a little bit about some of the health risks of being overweight or obese, such as diabetes and heart disease, high blood pressure, and other health issues. So that's why there is a big concern. Now, when it comes to rapid infant weight gain, I mentioned that obese children often become obese adults. There was found to be an increased risk of later obesity. However, many of the studies that we had up until very recently have not controlled for feeding methods. So in other words, this was just across the board. They didn't take into account whether the babies were directly nursed, or whether they were bottle fed. So let's talk a little bit about how this got to be a controversial topic. Now, let me just say before I get into the controversy, this is an important issue because in many areas, especially in the US, funding for programs may be directly tied to obesity. And so whether or not breastfeeding is, reduces risk of obesity can be a major factor in whether breastfeeding programs get funded. So that's one of the reasons that this controversy is important. And so one of the reasons that I'm telling you about it is so that if you're in a position to try to promote a program, a lactation support program, and you want to tap into any funds that have been designated for obesity, then you need to know about this controversy and be able to answer about it. So this is one of my favorite quotes from Mark Twain. He happens to be one of my favorite American writers. There are three kinds of lies, damn lies, and statistics. And I think this applies very, very well when we're looking at the research around breastfeeding. So for those of you who know a little something about studies and about how we determine what evidence is reliable, you can see here that this pyramid represents an increasing quality of evidence. So in other words, at the very bottom of the pyramid, we have, like, if I were to give you my opinion, depending on the topic, I might fall into that category. If it's lactation, I might be considered an expert opinion, but it would still just be an opinion. So that's at the very bottom. And then we have studies that talk about individual cases, and this may have some value, but again, it's just individual cases. So that's at the lower end of the pyramid. We have other types of studies, case control studies, so where we look at individuals, let's say with a specific condition, and try to draw conclusions. And then we have cohort studies where we just take a group of people and, like, we might be looking at the incidence of something, how much of a risk is there of a certain health condition developing. And then we have, the three top levels, the randomized controlled trials, systematic review, and meta-analyses. And these are considered the highest quality of evidence. And in fact, these randomized control trials are considered the gold standard when you're looking at a treatment option. So if you're looking at breastfeeding, for example, as being the treatment for preventing obesity, a randomized control trial might be considered. And that's when similar people are assigned to groups randomly. So you take people that, let's say, are in the same demographics, the same age, the same health, that sort of thing, and you assign them randomly to one group or another. And another way to do these is if the people who are doing the research actually doesn't know who's, like, when they're seeing a person in the study, they won't know which group they're in, and that would be called a blinded study. So the problem with trying to use a randomized control trial with regard to breastfeeding and obesity is it's not considered ethical to randomize families to either formula feed or breastfeed, because we already know how valuable breastfeeding is to our children's health. So that's not something we can really do. So we have some people arguing that really the research that we have on the health effects of human milk, for human babies is not really very valid. It's lower on the pyramid. And so therefore we can't prove that breastfeeding actually reduces risk of obesity. Because, for example, we don't know if someone is nursing, if they're different in significant ways. So, for example, it may be due to not to the fact that the baby was human milk fed, but maybe due to some other factor. So that's one of the problems with the studies not being randomized. So what we have with regard to lactation and obesity are primarily what's called observational studies, but these can have what's called confounders. For example, perhaps families who choose to nurse their babies are choose other lifestyle or nutritional options that are healthier as well. Maybe they wash their hands more. Maybe they treat their babies differently than families who are bottle feeding formula. We actually have a study that just came out last year, 2020, that did actually find out that the parents who nurse their babies tend to also give them better nutrition when they start solids. But maybe, some people have suggested, like this book at the bottom, Is Breast Best? That was sort of a book that tried to disprove a lot of the claims that are made about breastfeeding and health. So, is it maybe, as I say, maybe parents wash their hands more when they breastfeed as compared to those who formula feed. So that is a problem. However, the study, this Vidke study, that did find that nursing families did provide better nutrition after solids were started, said that it actually didn't seem to make a significant difference in the outcomes. So where did the controversy come from? Well, it came from some studies in some very reputable journals. There was something called the Probit study, which I'll tell you more about in just a moment. And researchers or scientists who were writing for journals used this Probit study as the basis. And they concluded, this was an article in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is a very highly regarded journal. Breastfeeding does not have important anti-obesity effects in children. You can see that one was from 2013. And here's another one from the Journal of the American Medical Association, again, a very reputable journal. Population strategies to increase the duration and exclusivity of breastfeeding are unlikely to curb the obesity epidemic. So let's take a look at this Probit study and see what the problem is and why maybe those conclusions are not correct. Well, the Probit study is short for Promotion of Breastfeeding Intervention Trial. So I mentioned that you can't do a randomized control trial. You can't assign families to either breastfeed or formula feed. So what they did instead in the Probit study is they did a coin toss to decide which hospitals in the country of Belarus would become baby friendly. Some of them became baby friendly and some of them didn't. And so the assumption was those who gave birth in the baby friendly hospitals were doing more breastfeeding. And so they compared the babies from the two different types of hospitals, baby friendly or non-baby friendly. Now, the problem with that is that the Probit study, it only involved women who initiated breastfeeding after giving birth and excluded all non-breastfed infants. So in other words, this Probit study didn't even look at babies who were strictly formula fed. And its results reflect the effects of slightly longer duration of breastfeeding, as well as much higher exclusive breastfeeding, but do not compare any breastfeeding to totally non-breastfed infants. So to say that breastfeeding does not have anti-obesity effects based on this study really doesn't make sense, because they did not compare breastfed babies with those who were not breastfed. It was only babies who were breastfed for a shorter time or less exclusively with babies who were breastfed more exclusively for a longer time. And we do have some of these very high level type of articles, meta-analysis and systematic reviews that did find a connection. Now, a systematic review is when you look at all of the relevant, like really high quality studies, and you draw conclusions from that. And what a meta-analysis does is it actually takes the data from some of these other studies and combines them. So you have a much larger population that you're looking at. So this was this Jan meta-analysis that's cited down at the bottom, found that breastfeeding was a significant protective factor against obesity. And the other meta-analysis, which was both a meta-analysis and a systematic review, found that breastfeeding decreased obesity risk by about 13%. So although we don't have randomized control trials, we do have some really good studies that are very high quality that show this. But when we look at obesity and we look at how infant feeding might affect obesity, one of the confusing aspects of this is that there are many factors that have an effect, and they can interact with one another. So for example, this study, which was from 2016, found that at age 4, only in the white families did breastfed children have lower rates of obesity than those who were formula fed. So this was a diverse group that looked at families of different racial backgrounds and found that it was only effective among white families. What are some other factors that might increase the risk of childhood obesity, and how do they factor in? Well, parental overweight actually has a much greater effect on risk of obesity than infant feeding. So, for example, this study found that the parental obesity increased risk of childhood obesity by about 40%. You saw one of the studies previously said breastfeeding gave protection of about 13%. So clearly, if the parents are overweight or obese, that's going to have a major effect. It's going to have a much greater effect than how they feed their babies. Smoking and lower socioeconomic status also are risk factors. Those who smoke and are the lower socioeconomic status are more likely to become obese than those who don't smoke and are a higher socioeconomic status. Now, this is this infographic. Excuse me. This infographic represents something that is called a first food desert. You've heard of food deserts, and that's areas in metropolitan cities, excuse me, that don't have grocery stores. Maybe they just have convenience stores. It's very difficult for families to get nutritious foods. Well, the people who compiled this infographic looked at what they called a first food desert, those parts of cities and other areas where there's no breastfeeding support for families who want to nurse their babies. So, this can be a factor too, depending on where people live. I like to think today there are very few first food deserts here in the US. We have so many lactation supporters, like you all are. So let's hope there aren't a lot of areas where families can't get decent lactation support. Here's another risk factor for obesity, not surprising. This one's pretty obvious. Too many calories and too little exercise. This picture reminds me a lot of my little boys. I had 3 boys when they were growing up. So that's another risk factor. So there's lots of different risk factors. Family behaviors and attitudes, of course, play a role as well. What is the quality of the diet that families consume? What are their attitudes about eating? Are they the kind of family where they insist that everyone has to finish their plate? Or are they more baby-led, where they put food in front of the baby, but then it's really up to the baby to eat as much or as little as they want? What are their cultural beliefs around obesity? In some cultures, babies who are fat are considered healthier than babies who are thinner. Do they have the cultural belief that anytime a child cries, that means they're hungry? So these factors can make a difference too. What are their exercise habits? So there are a lot of different confounding factors that can influence the risk of overweight and obesity in a given family. One way that researchers sometimes try to tease out a risk of certain behaviors is by looking at siblings, because they figure that genetically they're probably pretty similar. So this was a study that looked at sibling pairs with one of the siblings breastfed and then one that wasn't. And the breastfed sibling was less likely to reach the family's BMI thresholds compared to the non-breastfed sibling. And the difference was more than 13 pounds at age 14 with average height. So they did find in the sibling study that it did make a difference. Here was a twin study. So with twins, you're probably, as you can see here, more than 2/3 of them were actually fraternal twins. So that would be similar to a sibling study, but 31% were identical. So about 1/3 of them were identical, meaning that they would be genetically identical. And so they looked at the 18-month checkup, at the weight and at the feeding history. And they did find that babies who were fed formula before 4 months of age had higher BMIs than babies who were exclusively breastfed for at least 4 months. So parental obesity, I mentioned, has a very high risk for contributing to childhood obesity. So in this study from 2015, they looked at families that were considered high risk for obesity. So these were families in which the parents were obese, they smoked, they were white, they weren't white, they were smoking while pregnant, and they had very little education, so lower socioeconomic category. The babies who breastfed for less than 2 months were more likely to become obese than those who breastfed for more than 2 months. So even in high-risk families, it looks as though breastfeeding does make a difference. terms of reducing risk of obesity. This study I found interesting because they looked at breastfeeding for more than 6 months. It was associated with lower body mass index in those babies who were in the upper weight percentiles, but it actually had no effect on those who were below the 50th percentile. So the researchers suggested that rather than shifting the entire distribution of adiposity or fat-related measures in childhood, breastfeeding selectively protects against extremes in body size and fat distribution. So let's talk about what makes the difference in terms of how we feed babies, the biomechanics of infant feeding. And we'll start by talking about the milk intake when a baby is directly nursing versus bottle feeding. So this is a quote. I spoke some years ago at a conference for pediatric nurses, and they have this organization, NAP, and they were giving out these, they were laminated cards that had messages that they were sharing with families. And they had a number of them about breastfeeding and bottle feeding that I thought were really good. They really kind of cut to the chase. So this is a quote from one of those cards. Bottle-fed babies cannot control the amount of milk they drink as well as breastfed babies. Bottle-fed babies are more likely to be overfed. So that really kind of sums it up. So what we see when we look at milk production in nursing babies is during the first 5 weeks or so, you have that very intense period. Sometimes I refer to it as the first 40 days, where babies are nursing very, very intensely. And that causes milk production to increase from birth to about 5 weeks. And then once we reach what we consider full milk production, which is about 25 ounces a day, then we see a plateau in the amount of milk, the volume of milk per day that babies take from about 1 month to about 6 months. It's actually remarkably similar. And once babies start solid foods, we see a decrease. Of course, it could be a gradual decrease because they often start very gradually, but solid foods do take the place of human milk in a baby's diet. So this is the pattern that we see in terms of milk intake for the nursing baby. So between 1 and 6 months, basically nursing babies get about the same volume of milk per day. So as I say, the peak milk intake, there's maybe a slight difference. It goes up on average, maybe 2 to 4 ounces over that 1 to 6 month period. It's not a big difference. So the peak averages around 25 ounces. Some babies take a little bit more, and the reason why, some people say, well, how is that possible? Because if we're used to bottle feeding babies, then what we typically see is babies take more and more and more. But what the scientists tell us about this is that with nursing babies, over time, babies' growth rate slows, and it slows to the point where really they continue to grow, they get bigger and heavier, even though they're taking about the same volume of milk every day. So that's something that's different between breastfed and bottle fed. And I think it's very helpful to understand these differences. So this was a study, one of my favorite kind, that looks at what's normal. So that looked at normal breastfeeding babies. And you can see there's one column for the breastfed baby at 4 weeks and another column at 13 weeks. There were 52 exclusively nursing babies who were studied here. And you could see they looked at milk volumes in terms of milliliters, but 30 milliliters equals 1 ounce. So you can see that at the bottom there, you have the milk intake per day, 24-hour milk intake. And you can see that there's really a difference of less than 1 ounce between a 4-week-old baby and the 13-week-old baby. They've gone down maybe 1 feed a day from 8, average of 8 to an average of 7. Maybe their feedings are getting a little bit shorter, they're sleeping a little bit longer, and maybe the amount of milk they take at each feeding is increasing slightly, but you could see there's not a big difference between the 4-week-old breastfed baby and the 13-week-old breastfed baby. And when we compare babies who are nursing, directly nursing, with babies who are bottle-fed formula, what we see is that over time, the formula feeding babies take much more milk. This is at an average feeding. So that, a lot more milk, 49% at 1 month, 57% at 3 months, 71% at 5 months. So a really major difference. When we look at milk intake over the course of a 24-hour day, we see that formula feeding babies are also taking much more milk than directly nursing babies. So, they take a lot more at a feeding, but of course they maybe feed fewer times a day. But even over the course of a full day, they're still taking quite a bit more milk. So there is a difference in how breastfed and formula fed babies feed. So as I mentioned, babies who are bottle fed formula typically feed fewer times per day, and they take more milk per feed. So for a nursing baby, maybe 8 feedings a day is average. For a bottle feeding baby, it's closer to 6. So that's something to know about. Is that a good thing? Some parents might say, well, that saves me time, but it also can create an overfeeding pattern. And we'll see that as we go along here. So why is it that babies take more milk by bottle? Well, there's a number of possible reasons. One is that unlike nursing, where there's with the milk ejections, you get a faster flow, and then you have a period of time where the milk flow is slower, and then it goes faster again with more milk ejections, and then slower. So you have it sort of alternates between fast and slow. With the baby who's bottle fed, especially bottle fed the way you see pictured here, with the bottle tilted up and the baby leaning back, this consistent flow can override the baby's appetite control mechanism. They tell us as adults to eat slowly so that we don't overeat before we realize it. You have to give your body a chance to, have your appetite control mechanism kick in. So if we eat slower, we'll realize we're full before we eat too much. Same thing is true for babies. Another difference is when a baby is nursing, typically the first milk they get is a little bit lower in fat. And then as the feeding goes on, there's more fat content in the milk. So there's a cue there that lets babies know, oh, I'm getting this high fat milk now, and maybe that contributes to feelings of fullness. Also, when an adult is bottle feeding a baby, there's that temptation to try to empty the bottle so that you don't waste anything. And so, on the other hand, perhaps that baby typically takes 4 ounces, let's say. So if they only take 3 ounces at one bottle feeding session, the feeder may think, oh, well, I'm going to keep coaxing this baby because they usually take 4 ounces. Whereas with a breastfeeding baby, that's not the case. We don't know how much the baby's getting. So we just assume when the baby's done, the baby's done. I gave this talk at a conference where there was another speaker, Kirsten Uvnes-Moberg, who's a world-class expert on hormones, especially oxytocin and breastfeeding. And she said that actually the sucking, the hormones of sucking are different with bottle feeding and breastfeeding. That with breastfeeding, there's a hormone that's called cholecystokinin, or CCK, that might also contribute to babies feeling fuller earlier than if they're bottle feeding. So I added that to my list. So I was, for a while, working for a corporate lactation program, and I was speaking to mothers every day about, during their maternity leave and going back to work and that sort of thing. And so one day, a mother called me and she said to me, she says, oh, I've come up with such a great idea on how to simplify my life with a newborn. Well, I'm always interested in that because one of my missions is to try to simplify life for new parents. So I said, well, what are you doing? And she said, oh, well, instead of nursing 8 times a day, I'm pumping my milk and I'm feeding my baby 4 8-ounce bottles a day. and I thought for a minute, I thought, what do I say in response? And so after a moment of thought, I said to her, well, gosh, just think, if you gave your baby 1 32-ounce bottle a day, you'd only have to feed once a day. In response, she laughed, which was what I was shooting for there. But that kind of opened the door to talk to her about, of course, a baby taking 32 ounces at one sitting is obviously impossible, but her baby was also suffering from reflux. And so, it gave us a chance to talk about why smaller, more frequent feedings actually are healthier for babies than larger, less frequent feedings. So timing is also an important factor in how babies are fed. This was a study that fascinated me. It was done in 2005. And one of the things that was really unusual about it is it actually followed these individuals for 20 or 30 years. And they looked at weight gain during the first 8 days of life, and they found that babies who gained more weight during the first 8 days, this was associated with adults overweight. And they concluded that this was a critical period where our physiology is programmed. Of course, we know that during the first 8 days of life, if you're exclusively nursing, what happens is that, of course, the baby gets very little colostrum at first, and gradually the milk production increases. And then, we of course see less weight gain during that first 8 days among nursing babies. Even those, rare exceptions who don't really lose weight after birth, typically the weight gain isn't going to be as great as babies who are formula fed. So the researchers concluded that every 100 grams, which is about 3 ounces gained during the first week, increased the risk of adult obesity by 28%. So again, this first 8 days is a very critical period where it seems like something about our body functions are programmed that will make a difference later in life, and whether we tend towards obesity or we don't. And there was a study in which they didn't go for 20 to 30 years, but this was one where they tried to replicate this. They looked at the children for 2 years, and they found the same thing. So this was done in 2018. Those who gained more than 100 grams or more in the first week were 2.3 times more likely to be overweight at 2 years. And the nursing babies were much less likely to gain. So during this critical window, nursing babies are at a real advantage. So this might be one factor that might influence this picture. I found this dynamic really interesting. During the first 6 weeks, when newborns were fed a very high calorie formula or a very dilute formula, they consumed the same volume. So in other words, the first 6 weeks, newborns feed by volume rather than what's contained, in the milk. After 6 weeks, the babies were able to adjust the volume based on the calories. So in other words, they took less of the high fat, high calorie milk after 6 weeks. So that's something that seems to be true depending on age. So feeding method has an effect on babies' ability to tell when they're full, and that's referred to as self-regulation. So there were a number of studies that were done that they found a connection between babies' bottle emptying, like completely emptying the bottle, to a greater weight gain. They found from birth to 6 months, those who emptied the bottle were at a 69% greater risk of excess weight gain by 6 to 12 months compared with those babies who rarely emptied the bottle. So they considered this bottle emptying to be a risk factor for later overweight and obesity. This was another study they did a couple years later. So the babies from birth to 6 months who were fed at least 2/3 of their milk by bottle were twice as likely to empty the bottle or cup by 6 to 12 months. So how many bottles a day or how often they got bottles seemed to make a difference with this. And then a later article, they concluded that infants frequently fed by bottle may gradually lose their ability to self-regulate and ultimately gain weight more rapidly than those fed directly at the breast. So does it matter what's in the bottle? We're talking about bottle feeding. So what if it's human milk in the bottle, or as compared to formula? Well, these same researchers actually looked at that. They had a very large group that they were looking at, almost 1,900 babies, but they were able to tease out the various feeding methods that were used. So you could see here in terms of weight gain, those who got a bottle, they were fed, these were fed only human milk, given by, if they were fed by bottle with human milk, they were the lowest, or excuse me, less than 1/3 of the time they were fed by bottle. Then they gained the least, which was considered the group that you want to be in, the good group. But the more the babies got their feedings by bottle, even if it was only human milk, then the greater their weight gain. So in other words, it is the feeding method more than what's in the bottle that seems to make the difference. The milk delivery and weight gain during the first year of life. So monthly weight gains varied. So the highest weight gain among all of these groups of babies who were fed in different ways were those who were fed expressed mother's milk by bottle. So those were the ones who were pumping and bottle feeding. And the lowest weight gain, monthly weight gain, were those who were exclusively and directly nursing. So why would it be that you would see this, that the babies who got only human milk by bottle were actually in the heaviest category? Well, I have my thoughts. I mean, I don't know for sure, but I would guess that parents who work that hard to express milk for their baby probably don't want to waste a drop of it. So perhaps those parents were much more likely to coax their babies to finish the bottle. So you see the difference, what's considered the reference or what is desired in terms of weight gain was the baby who was directly breastfeeding. But you could see that as the baby started taking bottles, human milk only, bottles with human milk and formula, bottles with formula only, bottles with breastfeeding bottles with formula, the bottles only had formula, different groups here. You could see that the least weight gain was among the direct breastfeeding, and the highest weight gain was bottle only with human milk in the bottle. So very, very interesting. This was a 2018 study that followed feeding types for 1 year. They looked at breast, bottle, and solids, and they found that direct breastfeeding was inversely associated with weight gain and velocity. In other words, those who were directly breastfeeding gained weight more slowly, and the effect diminished when human milk was bottle fed. So they found the same thing, that even if it's human milk that's in the bottle, is when babies take more and more milk from the bottle, then they gain weight faster. So we can say that both feeding method and milk affect weight gain, but it does seem that bottle feeding can override the positive effects of human milk on weight. So that's what we can conclude from after looking at all of that. So what about feeding style? Well, to me, it's not very surprising that those who directly nurse their babies might develop a certain amount of trust that their babies know when they've gotten enough milk. Since we don't have ounce markers on our breasts, we don't really know what the baby's taking. And so what these researchers found was that the longer the mothers in their study breastfed, the less controlling they were with their baby's feeding style at 1 year. And in other words, these were the mothers who were less likely to be like coaxing and prodding and pressuring the babies to feed more and more and more. They were more likely to let the baby set the pace and feed however much they wanted rather than pushing more. But they also found that a less controlling feeding style only partly explained the protective effect of breastfeeding on obesity. So again, there's many factors at work here. Formula feeding and scheduled feeding was linked to greater weight gain in the early months. So both of those things are not good when it comes to risk of obesity. They increase the risk of obesity. Now, one of the things that we suggest is that when babies are bottle fed, and I would say this would really include any babies who's bottle fed, whether it's human milk or formula in the bottle, that it's really a kindness to do something that's called paced bottle feeding. And paced bottle feeding involves trying to mimic the ebb and flow of nursing. So to make bottle feeding more like nursing. So the idea is you use a slow flow of teat as the baby will accept, and you feed according to the baby's cues rather than on a schedule, holding the baby a little bit more upright. Start with the bottle horizontal, and then after every few sucks, lower the end of the bottle so the baby can get breathing breaks, and then when the baby's ready to start sucking again, you lift it up. So it maybe takes a little bit longer, but the baby has a lot more control over milk flow and is less likely to overfeed. And I did include with this session a handout that I developed for the caregiver of the breastfed baby, which includes instructions on paced bottle feeding. And that's something that I give out for free. And if you like it, and you're welcome to provide it to families who are in your care. So again, this is a way that we can help prevent overfeeding in babies who do get a lot of bottles, because this isn't always something that families have a lot of choice over. So this is just a way to make bottle feeding more like breastfeeding. So let's take a look at milk composition, human milk versus formula, and some of the effects those differences might have on a baby. One is the effects of the protein content in the milk. This again is from the laminated cards that I got from NAPNAP, and I thought this was very well put. Formula has more protein than breast milk. This is not a good thing. The high protein content in formula may lead to too much weight gain, obesity, and type 2 diabetes later in life. So what the research tells us is that during the first 2 weeks, and of course that includes that critical first 8-day period where our physiology is being programmed, formula-fed babies consume up to 5 times more protein than breastfed babies. And that's because formula is higher in protein content than human milk, but also because babies are taking in more volume, as we talked about already. So studies that looked at babies who were fed high protein formula, low protein formula, or breastfed found that with the high protein intake, there was more weight gain during the first 2 years. And the researchers concluded lower protein in infancy might lower the later risk of overweight and obesity. So here's some more studies that found higher protein intake is associated with faster weight gain and greater adiposity or more fatty tissue at 6 months, higher BMI at 2 years. So how does the difference in milk composition between human milk and formula affect the way our bodies work and how we use nutrition and our appetites? There's a number of studies that are interesting to me that look at this. So this study looked at sleep metabolism and found that babies fed formula used more calories during sleep than breastfed babies, 7% more at 3 months and 9% more at 6 months. So that tells you there really is a difference in the way the body functions, whether a baby receives human milk or whether the baby receives formula. Now, in my previous talk, we talked a little bit about the microbiome. There is a connection between the type of bacteria that's in our bodies and our risk of obesity. So I mentioned previously that our bodies contain more bacteria and other microorganisms than human cells. And the way that these microorganisms react with our bodies is they really interact with our cells, and including hormonal release, including those lining the body cavity. So in other words, in our gut. And so it affects the hormones that are released can affect things like insulin resistance, inflammation, and adiposity, or more fatty tissue. We know that the type of gut bacteria that a baby has will differ, whether they're exclusively human milk fed or mixed fed or formula fed. And even small amounts of formula can shift the microorganism balance from a breastfed to a formula fed pattern. So this is another way that it can change a baby and increase risk of obesity. So obesity is linked to this shift in gut bacteria. As far as nutrient use, we see that babies use the nutrients in formula less efficiently than the nutrients in human milk. This is an example of dietary nitrogen being used less efficiently in babies who are formula fed compared to babies who are breastfed. This again is from one of those laminated cards from NAPNAP. Formula does not have leptin. Leptin is an important hormone in breast milk that helps babies have normal weight gain or normal weight. Leptin helps control appetite and body fat. So there are a number of hormones in our bodies that do affect appetite, and leptin is one of them. It signals the brain to control the appetite, regulate body weight and energy metabolism. And it is present in human milk, but it's not in formula. And early exposure to leptin in human milk may influence body type. So this could be one other dynamic that might affect the risk of obesity related to infant feeding. Higher levels of leptin in mother's milk were linked to lower body mass index at 3 to 4 weeks. Also, when we look at hormones and how they interact in our body, what we know is that it's not enough just to have the right level of hormone in your blood. You need also to have receptors in your body that work well with the hormones. So a hormone and its receptor are a little bit like a lock and a key. If you have that's what insulin resistance is. It's you've got the right amount of insulin, but the receptors are like a rusty lock and the key isn't working. So the interaction between the hormone and receptors are a really important part. And high leptin sensitivity is linked to leanness, and overfeeding can lead to leptin resistance. So not only does formula not have leptin in it, but when babies continue to be overfed, then they are going to be resistant to any leptin they might be exposed to. Leptin levels are higher at night, but the dose is not associated with time between feeds. Now, another hormone, I learned a lot of new words when I was putting this chart together, is adiponectin. This one is secreted by fatty tissue, and it acts on the brain. It's involved in glucose and fat metabolism. So what the scientists think is that adiponectin may cause weight loss by raising our metabolic rate. In other words, our body runs faster without affecting our appetite. So it's not about appetite, it's really about our metabolic rate. This is a picture of a gentleman who I had the pleasure of hearing speak. And he has a message that I think is really important and very applicable here. Dr. Busher, he says, I know that human milk has nutrition in it. Certainly, that's one of its functions, but a much more important function is that it's an information system. It is directing the growth and development of the human infant. So the scientists found that there was an inverse relationship between adiponectin levels in milk and a breastfed baby's weight for height. So in other words, the more adiponectin that was in the milk, the less, the lower the weight for height ratio was. And the scientists concluded that this could be due to the modulation of infant metabolism by milk adiponectin. So this is another aspect of human milk that could be a factor. It's interesting, as I've been in breastfeeding for so many years, I sometimes see, formula advertises, they've added some new ingredient, but there's always hundreds of more ingredients that are still not in there. So these are just a couple of them. All right, so I want to spend a little time on early rapid weight gain in the breastfed baby. So rapid weight gain is, this is something we sometimes see. I've been seeing it since I first started in breastfeeding, and it is more common in formula-fed babies than those, and in those babies who are fed formula at night. So at 1 year, formula-fed babies with rapid weight gain had increased odds of overweight, but nursing babies with rapid weight gain did not. So we've actually had some research recently on these babies, these exclusively breastfed babies who have rapid weight gain. And what we always told families over the years was, just be patient. Their weight will fall into the normal range eventually. When they're crawling and walking and they start to get more exercise, that this will sort itself out. So they looked at two groups, 13 fast gainers, very fast gainers, and 18 normal gainers. And these were all exclusively breastfed babies. And they found that the period of rapid weight gain ended at around 5 months. So around the time the babies start rolling over and starting to crawl and that sort of thing. And they analyzed what was the difference between these two groups of babies. They found it had the same number of feeds per day. The 24-hour milk intake was a little bit higher among the fast gainers, but not statistically significant. But they did find a difference in the milk composition, that the babies in the fast gaining group had milk with low leptin levels. That was that hormone I mentioned that affects appetite. The normal gainers had double the fast gainers' blood leptin levels. So that I found really interesting. This was another one that looked at two specific cases, and they followed them for 42 months. And they did find what we've always predicted is that over time, exclusively nursing babies do reach the normal weight range, even though they may be very fast gainers in the beginning. So I think that's something now that the science is bearing out. So in summary, the nursing biomechanics reduce obesity risk because there's less weight gain during the critical first 8 days. The milk flow is variable, so the baby feels full with less milk. And the rising fat content during nursing sessions may signal that it's time to stop. Nursing gives children more control over their milk intake and promotes their healthy self-regulation. So they know they are better at telling when they're full. It fosters a less controlling feeding style in parents. And there are, the differences in milk composition between human milk and formula affects the health and the metabolic programming, the nutrient use, and the appetite. So these also could be a factor. So we've covered all of these various areas, and now I have a little bit of time for questions. We have about 7 minutes, I guess. Here, I'll put on, this is my slide that has all my contact information. So does anyone have any questions?
Can you hear me?
I can. Now I can hear you. Yes.
This is Stephanie. It's not playing the video, I don't think, but there is a question. I know that breast milk composition can become more or less calorie dense based on the baby's weight trends, but does pumped milk change in caloric value if there is no quote unquote communication between baby's mouth and mom's breast? Do you think this could have contributed to expressed milk in the bottle, leading to babies gaining the most weight?
Well, that's a possibility. I mean, as I mentioned, I was only guessing with my own ideas about why that might be true. The fact that, parents work so hard to express the milk, they don't want to see any of it wasted, but there certainly could be other factors as well. And, that your guess is as good as mine, because the researchers didn't really hazard a guess about it, but, that certainly could be a factor.
Thank you.
Sure.
So far, that's the only question that we have.
Okay.
Very interesting.
Thank you. So maybe we can end 5 minutes early, huh? And give a longer break.
Sounds good. Thank you very much, Nancy.
Thank you, Stephanie. I appreciate your help today.
You're welcome.
And thank you everyone for watching. Take care. Bye-bye.